Good evening. This is Fear Knocks. Along the Columbia River Gorge, the wind turns steel and stone into instruments. On some nights it whistles like a voice, echoes like a call from below the cliffs, and bends around the tunnels as if something out there is learning how to answer back. Hikers hear syllables return on the offbeat, railings vibrate into single notes, and spray near the falls sharpens the gusts until they sound almost intentional. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss our daily true horror stories. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Your comments help us keep posting every night. Tonight's reports come from viewpoints, tunnels, spray zones, and basalt walls where the wind shapes itself into something that feels just a little too close to language. Let's begin. I was an overlook ranger for the Park Service, conducting a routine late-night patrol. It was a cold, clear night in late autumn, the air barely above freezing. A faint, sustained hum seemed to carry on the wind from Vista Bend. My job involved monitoring the more remote sections of the Columbia River Gorge, especially after dark. The historic Columbia River Highway, with its winding turns and basalt cliffs, often presented unexpected challenges. I knew the area well, every curve of the road, every trail marker. My patrol vehicle was a familiar sight, its headlights cutting through the fog that sometimes rolled in from the river. I carried a radio, a logbook, and a small kit for minor trail maintenance. The isolation of the night shift was usually a quiet comfort, a time for observation and solitude. I would check the overlooks for any signs of vandalism or stranded hikers, then file my report back at the cabin. This particular night, the wind was a constant presence, a low roar from the river below, but the hum was distinct, separate from the natural sounds. I had been driving for about an hour, past the turnoff for Multnomah Falls, heading east along the old highway. The wind had picked up steadily since sunset, gusting hard against the vehicle. My jacket flapped against me as I stepped out at the smaller viewpoints. The air felt sharper, carrying the damp scent of pine and wet rock. I stopped at Vista Bend, a popular overlook with a stone wall and a long, heavy steel handrail. It offered a sweeping view of the river, though tonight the darkness swallowed most of the distant landscape. The hum was more pronounced here, a steady, low tone that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. It was not a mechanical sound, nor did it seem to be an animal. It was a pure, sustained note, like a tuning fork held against the wind. I walked toward the overlook, the gravel crunching under my boots. The wind tore at my uniform, making my jacket billow. The hum intensified with each step. It was coming directly from the handrail, a long, hollow steel pipe running the length of the viewing area. I pressed my gloved hand against the cold metal. A distinct vibration ran through it. The sound was not constant. It pulsed, rising and falling slightly in volume, but maintaining its pitch. It was an A-tone, a specific frequency that resonated in the air. I had heard wind whistles before, the high-pitched shriek through a gap in a window, or the low moan of a tunnel. This was different. This was a single, clear note, unwavering. I pulled out my phone, opening a spectrogram application I sometimes used to identify unusual sounds. The display immediately showed a strong, narrow band at about 440 hertz. It was perfectly stable, a solid line on the screen. I moved along the railing, trying to locate the source. The sound seemed to emanate from a section near the bend in the wall, where the railing made a slight curve. I ran my hand over the cold steel, feeling for any obvious damage or loose parts. There was nothing visible in the dim light from my headlamp. The wind howled around me, a chaotic symphony of natural noise. Yet the A-tone persisted, cutting through it all. I stood there for a few minutes, just listening. The sustained note began to feel unsettling. It was too perfect, too consistent for a natural phenomenon. Or so it seemed at first. The wind speed was considerable. I could feel its force pushing against me. But the tone remained. I took a photograph of the spectrogram display, noting the time and my location in the logbook. I considered calling dispatch, but what would I report? A musical railing? It sounded absurd. Still, the sound was unnerving. It felt like a presence, a steady, unwavering call in the vast darkness of the gorge. I checked the trail leading down from the overlook, shining my headlamp into the forest. No signs of recent activity, no footprints in the damp earth. The only sound was the wind, the river, and that strange, persistent hum. I decided to investigate further. I retrieved my anemometer from the vehicle, a small handheld device that measured wind speed. Back at the railing, I held it up. The display showed gusts reaching well over 50 miles per hour, with a steady average around 40. I moved the anemometer along the railing, trying to correlate the wind speed with the sound. The A-tone did not waver. It was as if the railing itself was singing, a single, clear voice against the roar of the wind. I noticed a series of small, narrow slits cut into the underside of the handrail, part of its original design for drainage. They were barely 1/4 of an inch wide, running along the length of the pipe. I wondered if these slits were acting like a reed instrument, vibrating in the strong wind. I spent another hour at Vista Bend, recording the sound with my phone, taking more photographs of the spectrogram. The wind did not let up. The cold seeped into my bones despite my heavy jacket. The sustained A-tone began to play tricks on my mind. It was so steady, so unwavering, that it started to sound like a distorted whisper, a low, drawn-out vowel. I knew it was just the wind, just the physics of the railing, but the isolation of the night and the sheer persistence of the sound made it feel like something more. I found myself looking over my shoulder, scanning the dark forest for any movement, any sign of another presence. The rational part of my brain told me it was an acoustic anomaly, nothing more. The primal part felt a quiet dread. I reviewed my wind log from the past few weeks. There had been several nights with high wind speeds, but no mention of any unusual sounds from Vista Bend. I also checked the maintenance notes for the overlook. The railing had been installed decades ago, a heavy-duty steel construction. There was a recent entry about a routine inspection, noting no structural issues. I made a mental note to contact the maintenance crew in the morning, to ask if they had ever encountered such a phenomenon. The thought of someone hearing that sound, alone on the trail, perhaps mistaking it for a call for help, was unsettling. Hikers sometimes ventured off trail in the gorge, getting lost or injured. A sound like this, especially in the dark, could easily be misinterpreted. I finally left Vista Bend a little past midnight, the A-tone still ringing in my ears even after I was back in the vehicle. The hum seemed to linger, a phantom sound. I drove slowly back to the cabin, the headlights cutting through the occasional patches of fog. The radio remained silent, only static breaking the quiet. I filed my report, detailing the unusual acoustic event, attaching the spectrogram photographs. I described the sustained A-tone, its frequency, and its apparent origin from the handrail slits. I recommended a closer inspection by the maintenance team, specifically regarding the potential for the railing to act as a wind instrument. The next morning, I spoke with the lead maintenance supervisor. He had never heard of such a thing at Vista Bend. He promised to send a crew out. A few days later, their report confirmed my hypothesis. The specific design of the drainage slits, combined with the extreme wind speeds common in that section of the gorge, created a resonant frequency. They noted that the precise angle of the wind and the specific velocity were critical factors. It was a rare occurrence, but entirely explainable by physics. The crew applied a small amount of sealant to the edges of the slits, slightly altering their aerodynamic profile. The A-Tone was gone. I still patrol the gorge at night. The wind still howls, and the river still roars. Sometimes on particularly blustery nights, when the conditions are just right, I think I can hear a faint echo of that sustained tone. It's a memory, a phantom vibration in the air, a reminder of how easily the natural world can mimic something far more unsettling. I was a field recorder, tasked with documenting ambient sound profiles along the historic Columbia River Highway. It was late autumn, a cold night with a thin fog clinging to the basalt cliffs. I noticed a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the wind's usual hum as I approached the first tunnel. My work involved cataloging the natural acoustics of the gorge, the rush of the river, the distant spray from the falls, the unique whistle of the wind through the various rock formations. I carried a stereo recorder, a set of sensitive microphones, and a collection of blank tapes. My routine was methodical. Set up, record for a predetermined interval, log the conditions, and move on. I had spent countless nights in that region, familiar with every echo and every gust. The isolation was usually a comfort, a quiet backdrop for the subtle sounds I sought to capture. The highway itself, often deserted after dark, offered a unique acoustic environment, especially within its old concrete and rock tunnels. I knew the way by heart, navigating the winding roads with only my headlights cutting through the occasional patches of fog. On this particular night, my objective was a series of short tunnels carved directly into the rock face, not far from Multnomah Falls. The air was still, barely above freezing, and a fine mist coated the asphalt. I parked my vehicle a short distance from the tunnel entrance, the gravel crunching under my boots as I walked. The tunnel was relatively short, perhaps 100 yards in length, with a slight curve. Its interior was rough-hewn, damp, and smelled of wet rock and old concrete. I set up my equipment near the center, positioning the microphones to capture the full breadth of the tunnel's natural reverberation. The only sounds were the drip of water from the ceiling and the faint, distant hum of the highway. I performed a standard impulse test, clapping my hands sharply to gauge the echo. The sound returned as expected, a clean, single reflection. I recorded a few minutes of ambient silence, then began to pack up, ready to move to the next location. As I gathered my gear, I decided to perform one last, informal test. I spoke a single syllable, a clear "ha" into the darkness. The echo returned, but not immediately. It came back on the offbeat, a fraction of a second later than I anticipated, a hollow moan that seemed to hang in the air. I paused, listening. The sound was distinct, not merely a delayed reflection, but something that felt like a response. I tried again, a short, sharp "hey." The same thing happened. The sound came back, a soft, drawn-out whisper, slightly out of sync with my own. It was unsettling, a subtle disruption of the expected physics of sound. I felt a prickle of cold on my neck, despite the lack of a breeze. I stood there for a long moment, my breath visible in the cold air. The tunnel was empty, the only light coming from my headlamp and the faint glow of my vehicle's headlights at the entrance. I walked slowly to the center of the tunnel again, my heel clicks echoing with a normal rhythm. I spoke another syllable, a simple "oh." The offbeat response came back, a low, drawn-out sound that seemed to emanate from just ahead of me, then fade into the tunnel's far end. It was not a direct mirror of my voice, but a distorted, almost mournful reply. My professional curiosity warred with a growing unease. I had never encountered an acoustic anomaly quite like this. I decided to extend my stay. I retrieved a longer tape and set up my recorder more deliberately, aiming the microphones towards the tunnel's interior. I began a series of controlled vocalizations, short, sharp sounds, then longer, sustained tones. Each time, the tunnel seemed to answer on its own schedule, a fraction of a second after my own sound had faded. The responses were always slightly different. A low hum, a soft sigh, never a clear replication. It was as if the tunnel itself was breathing, responding with its own unique voice. I tried varying my position, moving closer to one wall, then the other. The effect persisted. The air grew colder, and the fog outside seemed to thicken, obscuring the distant lights of the highway. The isolation of the tunnel deepened, making the strange echoes feel more personal, more deliberate. I felt a distinct sense of being observed, a quiet presence in the dark. The sound wasn't threatening, but it was profoundly unnatural, a violation of the expected order of things. I continued my tests for what felt like an hour, meticulously logging each attempt and the resulting echo. The hollow moan became more pronounced with certain frequencies, almost as if the tunnel was resonating with my voice. I felt a quiet dread settle over me, a feeling that went beyond mere scientific curiosity. I packed my equipment, the strange echoes still lingering in my ears. I drove back to my cabin, the radio static a welcome distraction from the silence. The next morning, I reviewed the recordings. The offbeat responses were clearly audible, distinct from the initial impulse. I spent the following days researching similar acoustic phenomena. I consulted with colleagues, describing the incident without embellishment. One suggested the possibility of a standing wave, a phenomenon where sound waves reflect and interfere, creating points of resonance and cancellation. I returned to the tunnel a few nights later, this time equipped with a sound level meter and a frequency generator. The fog had lifted, but the air remained cold. I systematically tested various frequencies, moving the meter through the tunnel. I discovered a pronounced standing wave at a specific frequency, one that resonated strongly at approximately head height. This wave, when excited by my voice, would sustain itself for a fraction of a second longer than the initial sound, creating the illusion of an offbeat echo. The tunnel, with its specific dimensions and material, was acting as a natural resonator. The scientific explanation was clear, a fascinating acoustic property of the structure. I compiled a detailed report, complete with decibel logs and frequency charts, and submitted it to the local authorities responsible for highway maintenance. They noted the findings in their file, acknowledging the unique acoustic profile of the tunnel. The incident was logged as an interesting but explainable natural phenomenon. The report provided a rational explanation for the offbeat echo. The standing wave was a measurable, physical reality. Yet, the memory of that night, the feeling of the tunnel responding, still holds a quiet power. I understand the physics, but the sensation of that hollow moan, that soft whisper answering me in the dark, remains. I still hear it sometimes, in the quiet moments, a subtle, lingering hum. I was a facilities technician for the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. My work involved routine checks and repairs across the Columbia River Gorge. One late autumn evening, a strange sound began to carry on the wind near Multnomah Falls. My job often meant working in isolation, especially during the colder months when tourist traffic thinned. The gorge is a place of dramatic basalt cliffs and constant wind currents, a natural wind tunnel for the Columbia River. I knew its sounds well. The roar of the falls, the rustle of the forest, the distant hum of highway traffic. My shifts frequently extended into the night, dealing with minor electrical issues or trail maintenance. I carried a radio, but reception was often spotty deep within the canyons. The air was usually cold and damp, often carrying the fine mist from the waterfalls. The first reports came in as vague complaints, whispers of an unusual noise near the historic pedestrian bridge at Multnomah Falls. It was described as a high-pitched tone, almost like a sustained musical note. I initially dismissed it as a trick of the wind, a common occurrence in the gorge. The wind could make the railings sing or create strange moans in the old highway tunnels. I had heard many such things over the years. My logbook entries from that period show several notations about increased wind activity. The sound persisted, however, growing more distinct. It was not the usual low moan of the wind through the trees. This was a focused, almost mechanical sound. It seemed to emanate from the vicinity of the bridge, a structure that spans the lower cascade of the falls. I decided to investigate it myself one evening, after completing a repair on a trail light further up the canyon. The sun had already set, and the last of the day's visitors were leaving the area. Headlights from the highway were visible through the trees, but the immediate area around the falls was quiet. The air was barely above freezing, and a light fog had begun to settle in the upper reaches of the gorge. I parked my truck and walked towards the falls, my heavy boots crunching on the gravel path. The sound was immediately noticeable. It was a fine hiss at first, almost imperceptible, but it quickly rose into a sustained, reedy wail. It was not loud enough to be painful, but it was insistent, cutting through the natural sounds of the falls. The sound seemed to vibrate in the cold air. I approached the bridge slowly, pulling out my handheld audio recorder. The device was usually for logging equipment noises, but it could capture ambient sound with decent clarity. As I got closer, the wail intensified, becoming a clear, resonant tone. It was unnerving. The sound seemed to shift slightly in pitch with each gust of wind that swept through the canyon. I could feel a subtle vibration in the metal of the bridge as I stepped onto it. The sound was coming from somewhere below, near the base of the structure. I shone my powerful flashlight down towards the water. The bridge had a protective mesh barrier installed along its underside, designed to catch falling debris and prevent access to certain areas. This mesh was usually taut and silent. Tonight, however, it seemed to be the source. The spray from the falls kept the mesh constantly wet, and the crosswinds were strong. I could see the fine droplets of water clinging to the metal strands. The sound was a direct result of the wind passing through the wet mesh, causing it to resonate. It was a kind of acoustic phenomenon, a sustained note produced by the specific conditions of wind, water, and tension. I spent about an hour on the bridge, recording the sound from various angles. The wail was consistent, a single, unwavering tone that seemed to fill the entire space under the falls. It was not a natural sound, and it felt out of place in the ancient forest. I tried to identify a specific point on the mesh where the sound was strongest, but it seemed to emanate from a general area, a section of the barrier about a few meters long. The cold wind bit at my exposed skin. I took several photographs of the mesh, hoping to capture any visible anomalies, but it looked structurally sound. The next morning, I filed a report detailing the unusual acoustic phenomenon. I included the audio recordings and photographs. My supervisor, a pragmatic man named Frank, reviewed the material. He acknowledged the strangeness of the sound, but agreed it was likely an environmental effect. We decided to schedule a closer inspection of the mesh. The primary concern was structural integrity, not the sound itself. A few days later, a small team, including myself, returned to the bridge. The wind was calmer that day and the wail was significantly reduced, almost a whisper. We accessed the underside of the bridge using a specialized lift. The mesh was indeed wet, glistening with the constant spray. We found no structural damage. However, one section of the mesh, a panel about a meter wide, felt slightly looser than the others. It was secured by a series of tension caps, and one of these caps appeared to be worn, allowing a minute amount of play in the mesh. This slight looseness, combined with the specific angle of the wind and the constant moisture, was likely creating the resonance. It was a subtle detail, easily overlooked during routine visual inspections. The solution was simple. We replaced the worn tension cap with a new, tighter one. The process took less than an hour. As soon as the new cap was secured, the subtle vibration in the mesh ceased. We waited for a stronger gust of wind, but the wail did not return. The fine hiss was gone. The sound of the falls returned to its usual roar, unadulterated by the strange, reedy tone. I logged the repair in the maintenance file, noting the replacement of a tension cap on the lower bridge mesh. The incident was closed. The official report stated a minor maintenance issue was resolved. There was no mention of the specific acoustic phenomenon, only the repair. The sound disappeared from the gorge. No more complaints came in. The wind continued to blow, the falls continued to roar, but the strange, sustained wail was gone. It was a simple fix for a complex environmental interaction. The incident became just another entry in a long logbook of minor repairs. Sometimes, when the wind picks up in the gorge, especially on a cold, damp night, I still listen for it. I listen for that specific, reedy wail. The memory of that sound, so precise and out of place, lingers. It was just a piece of wet mesh, but it sang a strange song in the isolation of the night. I was conducting a late-season trail assessment with my partner in the Columbia River Gorge. It was a cold, clear night, with the air barely above freezing. A distinct, vowel-like sound carried on the wind, seemingly from off the designated path. My partner and I paused, our headlamps cutting through the deep shadows of the forest. The sound was a drawn-out ah or oh, not loud, but clear enough to register above the natural sounds of the gorge. We exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of the irregularity. We were near the base of Horsetail Falls, a section known for its dense vegetation and the constant spray from the cascade. The basalt cliffs loomed above us, channeling the wind in unpredictable ways. The historic highway, a ribbon of asphalt, was a short distance below, but its hum was faint tonight. The sound came again, a quiet whisper on the cold air, and it felt out of place. Our routine involved volunteer trail maintenance and detailed survey work for a local outdoor organization. We frequently worked in the gorge, documenting trail conditions, checking for erosion, and mapping new growth or potential hazards. Our equipment was standard for such tasks: sturdy hiking gear, a reliable GPS unit, and a specialized parabolic microphone. This microphone was essential for acoustic surveys, allowing us to capture and analyze subtle sounds in the environment. We were accustomed to the night sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of the highway, the steady roar of the falls. The gorge's unique wind patterns, funneled by its towering basalt walls, often created strange acoustic phenomena. On this particular night, our objective was to assess a specific section of trail near Horsetail Falls, paying close attention to a new, dense growth of horsetail reeds along the stream bank. We had just reached the pool at the base of Horsetail Falls when the wind picked up. A sudden, strong gust swept through the canyon. The sound came again, clearer this time, a sustained, vowel-like tone that seemed to hang in the air. It sounded distinctly human, carrying a quality of distress. My partner and I stopped, listening intently, our breath visible in the frigid air. We swept our headlamps across the dark forest beyond the trail, searching for any sign of movement or light. The sound appeared to emanate from a dense thicket of vegetation, possibly near the stream bed where the reeds grew thick. We considered the possibility of a lost hiker, someone injured and calling for help. The ethical dilemma was immediate. Should we venture off trail into unknown, potentially dangerous terrain, or should we report the incident to local authorities? The gorge was unforgiving at night, with steep drops and slick, moss-covered rocks. Another gust of wind, and the sound repeated. It was consistent, almost rhythmic with the wind's ebb and flow. We decided to deploy the parabolic microphone to pinpoint the source more accurately before making any rash decisions. I retrieved the mic from my pack, extending its dish and connecting the headphones. A faint static filled my ears as I powered it on. My partner held the GPS unit, marking our current position. I aimed the mic towards the perceived source of the sound, slowly sweeping the dish across the dense vegetation. The mic confirmed the direction, focusing intensely on a specific, thick stand of reeds and cattails. The sound was amplified in my headphones, still vowel-like, but now with an underlying reedy buzz. A distinct vibration that had been masked by the open air. We tried calling out, shouting into the wind, but our voices were immediately snatched away, lost in the roar of the falls and the rushing air. The cold was biting, and the constant spray from the falls added a damp chill to everything. The sound persisted, a haunting, almost pleading tone, echoing the wind's passage through the hollow stems. The parabolic microphone provided a much clearer picture of the sound's origin. The acoustic data localized the source precisely to a specific patch of vegetation, a dense cluster of horsetail reeds and cattails. We consulted our detailed plant map of the area. It confirmed a significant stand of these hollow-stemmed plants in that exact location. The wind, we noted, was gusting consistently from the west, funneled directly into that thicket by the canyon walls. We began to analyze the sound, attempting to separate any perceived human-like qualities from the raw acoustic data. The mic allowed us to isolate specific frequencies. The sound possessed a distinct harmonic structure, entirely consistent with air passing through hollow tubes of varying lengths and diameters. It was a natural phenomenon, an acoustic illusion mimicking a human cry. We moved closer to the edge of the trail, still not venturing off, observing the reed stand. The ground was wet and slick with the constant spray from the falls. We could clearly see the reeds swaying violently in the gusts, their hollow stems vibrating. The sound was undeniably coming from them, a product of the wind and the plants. The realization was unsettling. The human mind's tendency to interpret ambiguous sounds as something familiar, something human, was powerful. We considered the potential consequences if we had rushed in, off trail, in the dark, driven by the perceived cry for help. The dangers of the gorge at night were significant. Unseen steep drops, slick rocks, hidden crevasses, and the risk of becoming lost ourselves. We spent a considerable amount of time recording the sounds with the parabolic mic, capturing multiple samples across different wind gusts. We also took several photographs of the reed stand and meticulously noted the precise wind direction and estimated speed. The isolation of the night amplified the strangeness of the event, making the natural sound seem even more profound. We logged the entire incident in our field report, detailing the acoustic findings and our observations. We then contacted dispatch via our radio, informing them of our findings and advising against deploying a search party based on the conclusive acoustic data. We completed our trail assessment, though the incident lingered in our minds. Our comprehensive report, including the acoustic data and photographs, was submitted to the local authorities and the Park Service. The incident was officially filed as a natural acoustic anomaly, a testament to the strange ways the environment can play tricks on perception. There was no subsequent search, and no missing person report ever materialized for that area. The experience reinforced the critical importance of careful observation and the strategic use of specialized equipment in ambiguous situations. It also highlighted the profound psychological impact that ambiguous sounds can have in isolated, dark environments. The cold of that night, the whisper of the wind, and the perceived cry for help remained a vivid memory for both of us. We discussed the event for weeks, dissecting the sound, the specific wind patterns, and our initial, instinctive reactions. I still think about that night in the gorge sometimes. The way the wind can shape sound, tricking the ear into hearing something familiar, something human. The memory of that vowel-like call, carried on the cold air, sometimes returns. It was not a person, but the sound itself held a strange, persistent quality. A quiet hum, a reminder of how easily perception can be altered by isolation and the night. I was documenting the unique acoustic properties of the Columbia River Gorge, a personal project focused on wind dynamics. The season was late autumn, and the air carried a sharp, damp chill from the nearby falls. I noticed an unusual delay in the natural echo returning from the opposite basalt wall. My routine involved extended solo hikes along established trails and occasionally venturing onto less traveled paths with proper permits. I carried a compact field recorder, a laser rangefinder, and a small, precise timer. My interest lay in how the gorge's specific geological formations and the prevailing wind patterns created distinct sound signatures. I would log wind speed, temperature, and atmospheric pressure at various points, cross-referencing these with audio recordings. This methodical approach usually yielded predictable results, grounding my observations in verifiable data. I always informed local dispatch of my general location and expected return time, a standard safety protocol for anyone spending significant time in the more isolated sections of the forest. On this particular evening, I was positioned at an overlook above a particularly deep section of the gorge, not far from the historic Columbia River Highway. The sun had already dipped below the western ridge, casting long, deep shadows that swallowed the canyon floor. A persistent, low hum vibrated through the air, a blend of distant highway traffic and the constant rush of the river far below. I had chosen this spot for its clear line of sight to a prominent basalt cliff face on the opposite side, a sheer wall that rose several hundred feet. The wind was picking up, pushing through the narrow gorge with increasing force, creating a low whistle as it passed through the metal railings of the overlook. I recorded a series of short, sharp claps, listening for the return. The first few echoes were as expected, a clean, distinct reply after a calculable delay. Then, as the wind intensified, something shifted. After one clap, the return sound was not a simple echo. It was a clipped reply, a distinct, almost vocalized sound that seemed to overlap with the metallic tone of the railing. It was too precise, too immediate to be a natural echo. The sound felt like a direct answer, not a reflection. I paused, my hand still on the recorder. The air felt colder, and a thin fog began to drift up from the river, softening the edges of the distant forest. I repeated the clap, this time listening more intently. The wind pushed against me, a steady pressure that made the gravel under my boots shift slightly. Again, the same phenomenon occurred. A fraction of a second after the expected echo, a second, shorter sound emerged. It was not a human voice, but it possessed a quality that mimicked one, a brief, almost guttural tone. I checked my equipment, ensuring the recorder was functioning correctly and that no external static was interfering. The sound was consistent, tied directly to my initial acoustic input. I tried a different sound, a short, sharp shout. The echo returned, followed by that same distinct, clipped response. It was unsettling. The isolation of the gorge, the encroaching night, and this unexpected acoustic anomaly created a quiet dread. I took a photograph of the opposite wall, noting the exact time and wind conditions in my logbook. The temperature had dropped noticeably, barely above freezing, and I could feel the cold seeping into my gloves. I decided to investigate further, despite the fading light. I needed to understand the source of this peculiar acoustic answer. My first thought was a secondary reflection, perhaps from a hidden alcove or a specific rock formation. I used the laser rangefinder to measure the distance to the basalt wall, confirming it was just over a quarter of a mile. Based on the speed of sound, the echo delay was consistent. The additional sound, however, was arriving too soon after the primary echo, almost superimposed. I tried moving along the overlook, testing different positions. The effect persisted, though its intensity varied slightly with my location. The wind continued to gust, and the railing hummed a constant, reedy note. I began to suspect the railing itself was a factor, vibrating in a specific resonance with the returning sound waves. I recorded several more sequences, capturing the primary echo and the subsequent answer. I focused on the precise timing, using the timer to measure the interval between the two distinct sounds. The interval was remarkably consistent, always within a few milliseconds of each other. This consistency pointed away from a random occurrence and towards a predictable physical interaction. I considered the possibility of another person, but the terrain was too steep, too inaccessible, and the sound too mechanical, too devoid of human inflection. There were no headlights visible on the distant highway, and the forest below was silent, save for the wind and the river. The isolation was absolute. I spent another hour meticulously documenting every variable. I noted the specific frequency of the railings' hum, which seemed to coincide with a harmonic of my own vocalizations. The cold was now biting, and a thick fog had settled into the gorge, obscuring the opposite wall entirely. I knew I needed to retreat before the conditions became too hazardous. I packed my gear, the strange, clipped reply still resonating in my mind. Back at my small cabin, I immediately began to analyze the recordings. I isolated the sounds, running them through spectral analysis software. The primary echo showed a clear reflection of my initial sound. The answer, however, revealed a complex overlay. It was indeed an acoustic phenomenon, a specific resonance. The wind, passing through the hollow metal tubes of the overlook railing, was creating a sustained tone. When my sound waves hit the opposite basalt wall and returned, they interacted with this wind-induced railing tone. The specific frequency of my sound, combined with the precise delay of the echo and the resonant frequency of the railing, created a momentary, amplified harmonic. This harmonic was then clipped by the continuing wind, producing that distinct, almost vocalized reply. It was an acoustic illusion, a trick of physics and environment. I compiled a detailed report, including the audio evidence in my analysis, filing it with my other research notes. The incident served as a stark reminder of how easily the natural world can mimic the familiar, creating an unsettling sense of presence where none exists. I still hear it sometimes, not the actual sound, but the memory of that clipped reply, echoing in the quiet of a cold night. I was a night volunteer for the Gorge Trail system. My shift began just after sunset, a cold evening in late autumn. That night, a sound began on the Multnomah Falls Trail that was entirely new. My duties involved routine checks of the lower and middle sections. I ensured gates were secured and reported any fallen debris. The air was often sharp, carrying the scent of wet basalt and pine. Headlights from the historic highway were visible through gaps in the trees, a distant hum. The Columbia River Gorge is known for its powerful winds, funneled through the basalt cliffs. I carried a radio, a flashlight, and a small pack with emergency supplies. My phone served as a backup communication device and a basic recording tool. This particular evening, the wind was picking up steadily. It started as a low whisper through the forest canopy. Then, as I approached the first set of stone switchbacks leading towards Benson Bridge, a different sound emerged. It was a thin, reedy whistle. The pitch was distinct, almost musical, and it seemed to rise and fall with the gusts. This was not the usual groan of the wind through the trees, or the rush of the falls. It was something else entirely. My routine usually involved a quiet patrol. I would walk the paved and gravel paths, listening for anything out of place. Most nights offered only the sound of the river, the wind, and the occasional distant vehicle. Isolation was a constant companion. I knew the trails well, every creak of the old bridges, every shift in the wind patterns. The gorge can be unpredictable, with sudden fog banks rolling in or unexpected frost forming on the stone steps. My primary goal was safety, ensuring no one was stranded after dark. I logged my observations in a small notebook, noting weather conditions and any minor maintenance issues. The work was solitary, but I found a certain calm in the rhythm of it. I had spent many nights on these trails, experiencing the full range of the gorge's nocturnal character. I understood its sounds, or so I believed. The whistle began subtly, a high, sustained note. It seemed to emanate from the stone railing posts along the switchbacks. As I ascended the steps, the pitch shifted. Each section of the railing, composed of thick stone pillars connected by metal bars, seemed to resonate differently. The wind, now a steady force, was hitting these structures at an acute angle. I paused on a landing, listening intently. The sound was not continuous. It would build with a gust, reach a peak, then fade as the wind momentarily eased. It was a series of individual pipes, each tuned to a slightly different note. The overall effect was unsettling, an unsettling melody playing itself out in the cold night air. I pulled out my phone and tried to record it. The microphone struggled against the general roar of the wind and the spray from the nearby falls. Still, I captured fragments of the distinct, high-pitched tones. I also carried a small, handheld anemometer. I held it out, watching the digital readout climb. The wind speed was consistently above 30 miles per hour, with gusts pushing much higher. The temperature was barely above freezing, and the air felt raw. The whistle intensified as I moved higher up the switchbacks, closer to the source. It was loudest where the wind was most directly funneled between the basalt cliffs. The sound was not static. It changed. As I climbed another flight of steps, the pitch would rise, sometimes by a full step, sometimes by a half. It was almost as if the stairs themselves were playing a scale. The posts, acting as a panpipe, were generating these tones. I could feel the vibration in the stone railing when I placed my hand on it. The cold stone hummed beneath my palm. The sound was thin, piercing, and carried a strange resonance. It was not a natural animal sound, nor was it the creak of old timber. It was purely acoustic, a product of the wind and the specific geometry of the stone and metal. The unsettling part was the way it seemed to mimic something else. In the lulls between the stronger gusts, the whistle would drop in volume and pitch, becoming a faint whisper. Then, as the wind returned, it would swell, almost like a call. I thought of the stories of lost hikers, of people calling for help in the vastness of the forest. The human ear is designed to pick out patterns, to find meaning in random noise. This sound, with its rising and falling pitches, its intermittent nature, felt like a deliberate signal. It was easy to imagine someone mistaking it for a distant cry. The isolation of the trail amplified this feeling. There was no one else around, only the wind and this strange, mechanical song. The sound was persistent, following me as I ascended, a constant companion in the darkness. I continued my patrol, but the whistle remained the focus of my attention. I tried to identify specific posts that produced the clearest tones. Some sections of the railing seemed to be more active than others. I noticed small gaps where the metal bars met the stone, or slight imperfections in the stone itself. These small apertures, when aligned with the crosswind, seemed to be the source. The wind was literally blowing across these openings, creating a resonant frequency. It was a natural phenomenon, but its effect was deeply unnerving. I reached the upper section of the switchbacks, where the trail narrows and the wind whips with even greater force. Here, the whistle became almost overwhelming. It was a cacophony of high-pitched notes, blending into a single, piercing shriek during the strongest gusts. My ears began to ache. I turned off my flashlight for a moment, letting the ambient light from the distant highway and the faint glow of the moon filter through the clouds. The darkness felt heavier, and the sound seemed to press in from all sides. I felt a strange urge to call out, to see if the sound would respond. I resisted it. I checked my radio. It was mostly static, a common issue in the deeper parts of the gorge. The signal was weak, making communication difficult. I knew dispatch would be monitoring, but I preferred to gather more information before making a report. I took several more photographs of the railing sections, trying to capture the angles and potential resonant points. The cold was seeping into my gloves, making my fingers stiff. The wind tore at my jacket. The thought of someone lost, hearing this sound and believing it to be a human voice, was a persistent worry. The gorge has many side trails, some unmarked, and people occasionally wander off the main path. A person disoriented in the fog or darkness, hearing what sounds like a distant call, might follow it deeper into the forest, further from safety. The whistle had a quality that suggested direction, a misleading guide. I imagined someone following the rising pitch, thinking they were getting closer to help, only to find themselves at the edge of a sheer drop or lost in a dense thicket. I spent another hour documenting the phenomenon, moving slowly back down the switchbacks. The sound lessened as I descended, but it never entirely disappeared. Even on the lower sections, where the wind was less intense, a faint, thin note would occasionally emerge. It was a reminder of the powerful, unseen forces at play in this environment. I made a mental note to include a detailed description in my logbook. This was beyond a simple weather observation. It was an environmental acoustic event, with potential implications for visitor safety. The wind was a sculptor of sound, and the gorge was its instrument. I completed my patrol and returned to the small cabin used by volunteers. The warmth inside felt like a sudden relief. I immediately began writing my report, detailing the wind conditions, the specific location on the switchbacks, and the nature of the whistling sound. I included my phone recordings and the anemometer readings. My logbook entry was precise, describing the pitch changes and the panpipe effect. I noted the potential for misinterpretation by hikers. The next morning, I submitted my report to the park rangers. They reviewed the evidence, acknowledging the unusual nature of the phenomenon. There were no immediate plans for structural modifications to the railings. The sound was deemed a natural occurrence, a product of the specific wind patterns and the existing infrastructure. They did, however, add a note to their internal file regarding unusual acoustic events in the gorge. It was a procedural outcome, factual, and without fanfare. The incident was logged, categorized, and filed away. The wind still blows through the Columbia River Gorge. I no longer volunteer on the night shifts, but the memory of that sound remains. Sometimes, on a particularly blustery night, I can almost hear that thin, rising whistle. It is a sound that belongs to the wind, to the stone, and to the isolation of the dark forest. It is a reminder of how easily the natural world can mimic something else, something human. something that calls out in the darkness. I was conducting a personal survey of ambient sound profiles near the Columbia River Gorge. It was late autumn, the air carrying a sharp chill and the scent of wet basalt. A subtle, unfamiliar hum began to resonate through the bridge deck beneath my feet. I had driven out from Portland that afternoon, intending to spend a few hours observing the wind patterns. My interest lay in the unique acoustic properties of the gorge, particularly how the wind interacted with its various structures. I carried a small kit, including a handheld anemometer and a smartphone running an accelerometer application. My routine involved parking near specific viewpoints, walking short trails, and recording data. This particular evening, I was at a smaller pedestrian bridge, one that offered a clear view of the river and the distant highway. The location was known for its strong, channeled gusts. The sun had already dipped behind the western cliffs, casting long shadows across the water. A thin fog was beginning to drift in from the river, softening the edges of the forest. The temperature had dropped noticeably, barely above freezing. I could hear the distant hiss of the falls, a constant background presence in this part of Oregon. The bridge itself was a simple steel structure, with a wooden deck and a cable guardrail system. It felt solid underfoot, designed to withstand the considerable forces of the gorge winds. I had walked across it many times before, always noting its sturdy construction. The hum started low, a deep resonance that I felt more than heard at first. It was not the usual vibration from passing vehicles on the main highway, which was a good distance away. This was localized, originating directly from the bridge structure. I stopped near the center span, placing my hand on the wooden railing. The vibration was faint but persistent. I activated the accelerometer app on my phone, holding it flat against the deck. The readings showed a consistent, low-frequency oscillation. The wind had picked up slightly, a steady push from the west. I could hear it whistling through the gaps in the basalt cliffs nearby. I walked slowly across the deck, trying to pinpoint the source. The hum seemed to intensify near the cable guardrails. These were simple steel cables, strung between posts along both sides of the bridge. They were designed for safety, not for acoustic properties. I knelt, pressing my ear close to one of the cables. A distinct, almost musical tone was now audible, a low, sustained note. It was not a creak or a groan, but a pure, resonant hum. The pitch seemed to fluctuate subtly, rising and falling with the gusts. I checked the anemometer. The wind speed was consistent, around 20 miles per hour, with occasional, stronger bursts. The hum, however, did not seem to directly correlate with the strength of the wind, but rather its direction and profile. It was as if the cables were acting like giant, taut strings, vibrating in sympathy with the air currents. The wooden deck amplified this resonance, turning the entire structure into a kind of sounding board. I took a few photographs of the bridge structure, focusing on the cable attachments and the gaps in the guardrail system. The light was fading fast, and the fog was thickening, making the details harder to discern. The sound began to change. The low hum was still present, but now a higher, reedy whistle joined it. This new sound seemed to emanate from the narrow spaces where the cables passed through their support posts. It was a thin, almost plaintive note, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. I walked back and forth, trying to isolate the source. The combination of the deep hum and the high whistle created a strange, unsettling chord. It felt less like a structural vibration and more like a deliberate sound. The isolation of the location, with the forest pressing in and the river below, amplified the effect. I spent another hour on the bridge, meticulously logging the wind speed and direction, noting the changes in the hump's pitch and intensity. The accelerometer data showed a clear pattern of increasing vibration amplitude as the wind shifted. The air grew colder, and the fog became dense enough to obscure the far bank of the river. The headlights of occasional cars on the distant highway cut brief, blurry paths through the mist. The bridge felt alive, vibrating with an internal energy that was both mechanical and strangely organic. The sound was constant now, a deep, resonant thrumming beneath my feet, overlaid with the high, thin whistle. I decided to report my observations. I drove to the nearest park ranger station, a small cabin a few miles down the highway. The ranger on duty was a young man, polite but clearly skeptical. I explained my findings, showing him the accelerometer readings and the photographs. He listened patiently, making a few notes in a logbook. He mentioned that they occasionally received reports of strange sounds in the gorge, usually attributed to wind tunnels or animal calls. He promised to file a report and forward my data to the maintenance department. I left my contact information and drove home, the hum still echoing in my ears. A few days later, I received a call from a Park Service engineer. He confirmed that they had investigated the bridge. Their initial assessment suggested that some of the cable tensioners had loosened over time, creating small gaps. These gaps, combined with the specific wind profiles of the gorge, were indeed causing the cables to resonate. They had tightened the tensioners and added dampeners to the cables. The engineer thanked me for the detailed report, noting that my accelerometer data had been particularly useful. He said they would add a note to the bridge's maintenance file. I returned to the bridge a few weeks later. The wind was blowing just as strongly, but the deep hum was gone. The high-pitched whistle was also absent. The bridge felt solid and silent underfoot, just as it always had before. The experience had been unsettling, a reminder of how easily the natural world, combined with human structures, can produce phenomena that defy immediate explanation. The memory of that sustained, resonant vibration, however, remained. I still hear it sometimes, especially on windy nights. It is a quiet echo in my mind, a low, persistent hum. I was a field technician for a regional parks department, tasked with routine infrastructure checks. It was late autumn, the air barely above freezing, and a persistent fog clung to the basalt cliffs. My first stop revealed a minor irregularity, a loose bolt on an interpretive sign panel at an overlook. My job involved inspecting and maintaining various public amenities along the historic Columbia River Highway. This meant long hours on the road, often alone, checking trail markers, picnic tables, and informational displays. The work was methodical, requiring attention to detail and a logbook for every observation. I carried a standard kit: tools, a flashlight, a portable audio recorder, and a contact microphone for acoustic analysis. The Columbia River Gorge is known for its unique wind profiles, and understanding how these forces affected structures was part of my ongoing brief. I often recorded ambient soundscapes, noting the specific hum of bridges or the whistle of wind through rock formations. My routine was predictable, a quiet rhythm of driving, walking, and documenting. The overlook sign was positioned on a small concrete pad, offering a view of the river that was mostly obscured by the fog that day. The panel itself was a standard aluminum sheet, about 3 feet by 4 feet, mounted on a steel frame. As I approached, I could hear the familiar low hum of the wind, a constant presence in the gorge. This particular hum, however, had an unusual quality. It was a subtle vibration, not just the general resonance of the metal, but something more focused. I placed my hand on the panel. The vibration was distinct, a rapid, almost frantic oscillation that seemed to originate from the center of the sheet. It felt like a low-frequency hum, but with a sharper edge. I retrieved my audio recorder and the contact mic. Attaching the mic to the panel, I put on my headphones. The sound was immediately clearer, isolated from the general wind noise. It was a narrow band of sound, a distinct peak on the recorder's spectrum analyzer, centered around 1.8 kilohertz. This was not the broad spectrum noise of wind or the low rumble of traffic from the highway below. This was a specific, sustained tone. As I listened, the tone seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, then with a more defined pattern. It wasn't a melody, nor was it random noise. It was a series of rapid, clipped pulses, like a sequence of short bursts. I leaned closer, trying to discern any pattern. The wind gusted, and the sound intensified, the pulses becoming more pronounced. It was difficult to describe, but the rhythmic nature of the vibration began to suggest something. It was not a voice, not in any conventional sense, but the way the sound modulated, the specific attack and decay of each pulse, created an impression. It was as if the panel itself was attempting to articulate something. The sound pattern was consistent, a repeated sequence of these clipped pulses, each one distinct from the last. I recorded several minutes of this, moving the contact mic across the panel's surface, searching for variations. The sound remained consistent, strongest at the center. I checked the mounting bolts. One of them, near the bottom right corner, was noticeably loose. It had backed out by perhaps a 1/4 inch. This was the initial irregularity I had noted in my logbook. I tightened it with a wrench, expecting the sound to change, to diminish, or to cease entirely. The hum did lessen slightly, but the distinct pulsed vibration persisted. It was as if the loose bolt had merely amplified an existing resonance. The sound was still there, a low, insistent presence, a series of rapid, almost percussive clicks and hums. The fog seemed to thicken around me, muffling the distant sounds of the forest and the river. The isolation of the overlook felt more pronounced. I spent another hour at the site, documenting the phenomenon. I took photographs of the panel, the mounting hardware, and the surrounding environment. The wind continued to move through the gorge, sometimes a gentle hiss, other times a powerful gust that made the entire structure tremble. Each time the wind picked up, the panel's strange resonance would intensify, the clipped pulses becoming more defined. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was a specific harmonic frequency of the aluminum, excited by the particular wind currents funneled through the gorge. The basalt cliffs created unique aerodynamic conditions, known for generating unusual acoustic effects. I considered the possibility of static electricity, but there was no crackle, no discharge. The sound was not loud, but its persistent, almost patterned nature was unsettling. It was a sound that seemed to mean something, even if I could not decipher it. I recorded more samples, trying to capture the nuances. The spectral analysis consistently showed that 1.8 kilohertz peak, a narrow band that suggested a specific source, not just random noise. I noted the temperature, which had dropped further, the air now feeling truly cold. The gravel underfoot crunched with each movement, a stark contrast to the panel's subtle hum. I considered calling dispatch, but what would I report? A sign panel that sounded like it was trying to speak? It felt absurd, even to me. I decided to return to the office and analyze the recordings more thoroughly. Before leaving, I tightened all the bolts on the sign panel, ensuring everything was secure. The sound did not disappear. It merely attenuated, becoming a fainter, more distant presence. The wind continued its work, a constant force shaping the landscape and, apparently, the acoustics of man-made structures. I drove back along the highway, the headlights cutting through the deepening fog. The radio in my truck was mostly static in this part of the gorge, a low hiss that filled the cabin. Back at the office, I uploaded the audio files. I spent the rest of the night in the quiet of my small workspace, running various filters and analyses on the recordings. The 1.8 kilohertz peak remained, a clear, distinct signature. The pulsed pattern was undeniable. It wasn't speech, but it wasn't random either. It was a structured sound, a sequence of rapid, almost percussive modulations. I wrote a detailed report, outlining my observations, the loose bolt, the wind conditions, and the acoustic data. I included the spectral graphs in the raw audio files. My supervisor reviewed it, noting the unusual nature of the findings. He suggested it was likely a complex aerodynamic resonance, a rare but explainable phenomenon given the gorge's unique environment. He filed the report, and the incident was logged. I returned to the overlook a few days later, during daylight hours with a colleague. The wind was calmer, and the fog had lifted. We found no further irregularities. The panel was silent, a simple aluminum sheet reflecting the pale autumn light. We checked the bolts again, all secure. The incident was officially closed, attributed to specific wind conditions interacting with a slightly compromised structure. My colleague heard nothing unusual, but I had heard it. I still hear it sometimes, not with my ears but in the quiet moments, a faint echo of that rhythmic vibration. It was a sound that resonated, a whisper of something just beyond understanding, a persistent hum in the back of my mind. I was a trail runner, out on a familiar loop. It was late afternoon, the air crisp with early winter. A sudden gust of wind felt different than usual. My route followed a contour path along the basalt cliffs of the Columbia River Gorge. This particular section was exposed, known for its strong, unpredictable wind patterns. I had run this trail hundreds of times, in all conditions, logging my runs and observing the microclimates. My routine included carrying a small digital recorder for ambient sound logs and a detailed topographic map. These tools helped me track my progress and understand the terrain's acoustic properties. On this day, the wind had an unusual quality, a low hum that vibrated through the rock. It was not the usual whistle or roar I expected from the slot gusts that often swept through the narrow canyons. The air temperature was barely above freezing, and the sky was a flat, uniform gray. I pulled my jacket tighter, the fabric making a soft zipping sound. The trail ahead was clear, a narrow ribbon of gravel winding around a prominent ridge spur. I felt a familiar sense of isolation, the forest quiet except for the wind's persistent whisper. The sound seemed to carry a strange static charge, almost palpable against my skin. The basalt formations amplified every subtle shift in the air current. My runs were usually solitary, a form of moving meditation. I preferred the trails less traveled, especially during the colder months when tourist traffic was minimal. The gorge offered a complex network of paths, some well-maintained, others barely discernible. I knew the terrain intimately, every switchback and rockfall. My focus was always on the rhythm of my breath and the feel of the ground underfoot. I often recorded the ambient sounds, later analyzing them for changes in wildlife patterns or unusual acoustic phenomena. This practice had become a part of my routine, a way to document the subtle shifts in the natural environment. I considered myself an observer, not just a participant. The isolation of the trails at night or in fading light was something I sought out, not something I feared. I carried a powerful headlamp, but often ran with it off, relying on the faint light from the highway below or the distant glow of city lights. The cold air sharpened my senses, making me more attuned to the forest's subtle movements. I rounded the spur, the wind momentarily dying down before rushing back with renewed force. It carried the distinct scent of damp earth and pine needles. Then I heard it, a shout. It was a clear, human voice, distant, but unmistakable. The sound seemed to come from my left, from deeper within the forest, off the main trail. It was a single, urgent call, not a cry of distress, but a sharp, attention-grabbing sound. I stopped immediately, my breath clouding in the cold air. I listened intently, my heart rate slowing from its running rhythm. The wind picked up again, rustling the dry leaves in the undergrowth, a soft hiss that almost masked other sounds. I waited for a second shout, but only the wind continued its low moan. I checked my map, orienting myself to the terrain. The area to my left was steep, heavily wooded, with no marked trails. It was not a place where hikers typically ventured. I considered calling out, but decided against it. A single shout could be anything. A hiker calling to a friend, or even a bird mimicking a human sound. I decided to continue for a few minutes, keeping my ears open. I started running again, moving slower now, my senses heightened. I had gone perhaps a quarter mile when I heard it again. This time the shout came from my right. It was the exact same sound, the same timbre, the same urgency. It was identical to the first shout. This was impossible. The trail curved sharply here, following the contour of the ridge. To my right was the steep drop-off towards the Columbia River, with the highway far below. There was no one there. The sound was distinct, not an echo. It felt as if someone had shouted from two different directions simultaneously. I stopped again, pulling out my digital recorder. I pressed record, holding it steady against the wind. The air was colder now, the light fading quickly. The sky had turned a deep, bruised purple. I scanned the terrain, my headlamp still off. I could make out the dark shapes of the trees, their branches swaying. I heard the distinct sound of my jacket fabric rubbing as I turned my head. The wind was a constant presence, a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, listening. The silence after the shouts was profound, broken only by the wind and the distant hum of highway traffic. I felt a prickle of unease, a sensation I rarely experienced on these trails. My analytical mind struggled to reconcile the two distinct sources of the identical sound. I pulled out my topographic map again, studying the contour lines. The ridge spur I had just passed was a significant geological feature. It created a natural acoustic barrier, but also a potential channel for sound. I considered the wind direction. It had been blowing generally from west to east, parallel to the river. The first shout, from my left, would have been coming from upwind, around the back of the spur. The second shout, from my right, would have been from downwind, across the open face of the gorge. This did not make sense. A sound traveling against the wind would be attenuated, not amplified. A sound traveling with the wind would carry further, but its source would be clear. I decided to retrace my steps to the spur. I needed to understand the acoustics of this specific location. The idea of two identical shouts from opposite directions was deeply unsettling. I moved cautiously, my feet crunching softly on the gravel. The light was almost gone now, and the forest was becoming a realm of shadows. I turned on my headlamp, casting a narrow beam ahead. The beam cut through the gathering fog that was beginning to drift up from the river. The air grew colder, and a faint frost began to form on the exposed rocks. I reached the spur, a massive outcropping of basalt. I stood there, listening again. The wind howled around the rock face, creating a complex pattern of eddies and currents. I could hear the distinct sound of the wind whistling through a narrow crevice in the rock. I spent the next hour meticulously investigating the area around the spur. I walked back and forth, listening, recording, and observing the wind's behavior. I used my map to pinpoint potential sound origins. The wind was the key. I noticed how it swirled around the basalt, creating zones of intense pressure and sudden lulls. I recorded the wind speed and direction using a small handheld anemometer I carried. The data showed significant wind shear around the spur, with gusts reaching over 30 miles an hour at times. I focused on the acoustic properties of the terrain. The rock face itself seemed to act as a natural amplifier and deflector. I imagined sound waves bending and reflecting off the hard surfaces. I tried to recreate the shouts. I called out myself, a single, sharp, "Hey!" The sound was immediately swallowed by the wind. I tried again, louder. This time, I heard a faint, distorted echo. But it was clearly an echo, not a distinct second source. I continued my methodical approach, moving to different positions relative to the spur. I considered the possibility of a person in distress, but the lack of any further calls and the identical nature of the two shouts argued against it. The sheer impossibility of the event was what held my attention.
It was a puzzle, a deviation from the expected. I decided to review my recorder. I found a sheltered spot behind a large boulder, partially protected from the wind. I put on my headphones and played back the recording. The wind noise was prominent, a deep hum and a high-pitched whistle. Then, clearly, the first shout. It was exactly as I remembered it. I fast-forwarded a few minutes. Then, the second shout. It was identical. The spectral analysis on my recorder showed the same frequency profile, the same duration, the same amplitude. It was the same sound, reproduced. The recorder's internal microphone was omnidirectional, picking up sound from all around. However, the perceived directionality was what was so unsettling. I continued my analysis on site. I used my headlamp to examine the rock face for any unusual features. I looked for any signs of human presence. Footprints in the gravel, discarded items. There was nothing. The trail was pristine. The forest was silent, save for the wind. I considered the possibility of a prank, but that seemed unlikely given the remote location and the precision of the acoustic event. The cold was starting to set in, and my fingers were stiff. I knew I needed to head back, but my curiosity was overriding my discomfort. I took several photographs of the spur and the surrounding terrain, documenting the exact conditions. I consulted my topographic map again, overlaying it with my wind data. I began to form a hypothesis. What if the wind, interacting with the specific contours of the spur, had somehow bent the sound? A sound originating from one side of the spur, carried by the wind, could theoretically be redirected around the rock face, creating the illusion of a second source. The wind shear data supported this. The air currents were not uniform. They swirled and compressed. This could create a sonic lens effect, focusing and redirecting sound waves. The identical nature of the shouts was the most compelling piece of evidence for this theory. If it were two different people, or even an echo, there would be some variation. This was a perfect replication. I returned to my vehicle well after dark, the headlights cutting through the thick fog that had settled over the highway. The experience left me with a profound sense of analytical satisfaction, yet also a lingering unease. I spent the next few days meticulously analyzing my recordings and photographs. I cross-referenced my wind data with historical weather patterns for the gorge. I even contacted a local acoustician, sharing my findings without revealing the exact location or the nature of the sound. The acoustician confirmed that such phenomena, while rare, were plausible under specific wind and terrain conditions. They referred to it as a sonic mirage. I compiled a detailed report, including my topographic overlay, wind profiles, and decibel logs. I filed it with the local sheriff's office, not as an emergency, but as an unusual incident report. I wanted a record of the event, a piece of evidence. The officer who took my report was polite but clearly skeptical. They noted it in the logbook as a reported acoustic anomaly. There was no follow-up, no investigation. My report simply became another file in their system. The emotional residue was subtle. It was not fear, but a deep, quiet dread. The realization that the environment could so perfectly mimic a human presence was unsettling. I have returned to that spur many times since, always with my recorder and anemometer. I have never heard the twin call again. The conditions have never been exactly the same, the wind never quite as specific. But sometimes, when I am alone on the trail, and the wind begins its low hum, I listen. I listen for that specific contour double shout. I know it was the wind, a trick of physics and terrain. Yet, the memory of that perfectly replicated human sound coming from two impossible directions still resonates. It is a whisper in the back of my mind, a reminder of the forest's profound isolation and its capacity for deception.
I was the lead ranger for the Columbia River Gorge district. My shift began just as the last light faded from the basalt cliffs. A faint, irregular hum reached me through the radio static. My work involved patrolling the trails and the historic Columbia River Highway, ensuring safety and maintaining the natural integrity of the area. The Gorge is a place of profound natural acoustics, where wind shapes the landscape and creates a symphony of sounds. I knew the difference between a gust whistling through a narrow slot canyon and the groan of an old bridge under stress. My routine was well established, a rhythm of checks and patrols, often under the cover of night. I carried a portable recorder and a logbook, documenting everything from trail conditions to unusual observations. The air was often cold, especially after sunset, carrying the damp scent of pine and the spray from the numerous waterfalls. The first reports began arriving in late autumn, just as the fog started to settle more frequently in the lower elevations. Dispatch relayed calls from hikers and occasional late-night drivers, describing strange sounds near the old tunnels and along certain exposed sections of the highway. They spoke of a low moan, sometimes a whisper, carried on the wind. Most of these calls were dismissed as misinterpretations of the Gorge's natural soundscape. The wind here can mimic many things, from a distant train horn to a human cry. My initial assessment aligned with this common understanding. I logged each report, noting the location and the reported sound, but without any immediate concern. One evening, a little past midnight, I was conducting a routine check near the Oneonta Tunnel. The air was barely above freezing, and a thin layer of frost coated the guardrails. My headlights cut through the heavy fog that had rolled in, making the basalt walls seem to loom even larger. The wind was picking up, creating a low, resonant hum as it passed through the tunnel's mouth. I parked my vehicle and stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots. I activated my portable recorder, a standard procedure for documenting environmental sounds or potential hazards. As I stood there, listening to the familiar symphony of the Gorge at night, a sound emerged that was distinctly different. It was a low, drawn-out moan, not unlike a human voice, but stretched and distorted by the wind. It seemed to come from deeper within the tunnel, then faded as quickly as it appeared. I noted its direction and intensity, comparing it mentally to the usual wind patterns. The sound was not continuous. It had pauses, brief silences that felt unnatural. I waited, listening intently. The wind howled, then died down, and the moan returned, this time with a slightly different timbre, almost a wavering quality. I walked a short distance into the tunnel, my powerful flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The air grew colder, and the sound of dripping water echoed from the unseen ceiling. The moan seemed to shift, moving with the gusts, but its underlying rhythm felt off. It wasn't the steady, predictable whistle of wind through a narrow opening, nor the metallic groan of the old bridge railings I knew so well. This sound had an organic quality, a subtle unevenness in its timing, like a breath being held and released. I recorded for several minutes, capturing the ambient wind noise alongside these intermittent, unsettling sounds. Over the next few weeks, the reports continued, sometimes from the same locations, sometimes from new ones along the historic highway. Each time I responded, recorder in hand, meticulously documenting the conditions and the sounds. I began to build a collection of audio files, each one a snapshot of a particular night in the gorge.
I also started cross-referencing these recordings with local weather station data, specifically wind speed and direction logs. My goal was to establish a clear correlation between the reported sounds and the natural forces at play. Most of the recordings showed a clear pattern. A sudden spike in wind speed would coincide with a sharp whistle or a deep hum from the bridge structures. The reed-like railings along certain overlooks were notorious for producing eerie, sustained tones when the wind hit them just right. The tunnels, too, acted as natural flutes, amplifying and distorting the wind's passage into deep moans. These were all explainable phenomena, part of the gorge's character. I could almost predict when and where a particular sound would occur based on the wind profile. However, one specific set of recordings stood out. These were from the Oneonta Tunnel incident and a few subsequent reports from a secluded trail near Horsetail Falls. When I overlaid the sound profiles from these incidents with the gust graphs, the correlation was weak. The moans and whispers did not align perfectly with the wind spikes. Instead, they appeared to have their own cadence, their own timing. There were distinct breath pauses, moments of silence that did not correspond to a lull in the wind. The sound itself had a different spectral signature, a slightly lower frequency range than the typical wind-induced structural vibrations. I spent hours in my small cabin, analyzing the waveforms, comparing them side by side. I used specialized audio software to filter out background noise, isolating the specific frequencies of the anomalous sounds. The difference was subtle but undeniable. The wind-generated sounds were consistent, almost mechanical in their repetition, varying only with the force of the gust. The other sounds, however, showed a slight irregularity, a human-like variation in pitch and duration. It was like comparing a machine's hum to a person's sigh. I compiled a detailed report, including my audio evidence and meteorological data. I presented my findings to the county sheriff's department and my superiors. The initial reaction was skepticism. The gorge was known for its strange sounds, and attributing any of them to a human source without direct visual evidence was a significant leap. But the analytical data was compelling. I demonstrated how the hoax recordings, as I began to label them, exhibited an uneven timing, a subtle offbeat quality that was absent from all the other wind-related incidents. The breath pauses were the key differentiator, a signature of human vocalization. The investigation shifted. Patrols were increased, not just for general safety, but with a specific focus on identifying the source of these sounds. We set up motion-activated cameras in the areas where the anomalous recordings had been made. We also installed more sensitive acoustic monitoring equipment, hoping to capture the sounds with greater clarity. The isolation of the gorge at night, combined with the dense forest and the sheer rock faces, made any search difficult. The cold and the fog often limited visibility to a few yards. One night, the new equipment near Horsetail Falls captured something definitive. It was a series of low moans, clearer than anything I had recorded before. The sound profile was unmistakably human, with distinct vocal cord vibrations and clear breath intake. It was still distorted by the wind and the environment, but the underlying human element was undeniable. The cameras, however, showed nothing. No figure, no movement. Just the swaying trees and the mist. It was as if the sounds were disembodied, floating through the night. The official conclusion was that a prankster or a group of individuals was responsible, using the gorge's natural acoustics to create a sense of unease. The lack of visual evidence, despite the clear audio, remained a point of frustration. We never apprehended anyone.
The incidents eventually tapered off as winter deepened, the extreme cold and heavy snow making the remote trails inaccessible. The file was eventually closed, marked as unresolved human interference. I still review those old recordings sometimes. The wind whistle incidents are predictable, almost comforting in their regularity. But the other files, the ones with the offbeat moan and the breath pauses, still carry a quiet dread. I hear the subtle variations, the human element hidden within the natural sounds of the gorge. It reminds me that even in the most wild and isolated places, a human presence can be the most unsettling sound of all.